Hello YouTube, this is Morgan Airspeed Prime here with my next The Promised Neverland video. This one is going to be my thoughts on the series overall. Now that it is over as of chapter 181, which came out just a few days ago, how do I feel about the series at this stage? Does the ending very much affect my view on the overall series or not? So, The Promised Neverland, Chapter 1 to 181, how is it? Overall, despite the ending, I still really love this series and think it's very good. For one, I think the thing that it's always had over a lot of other manga is just that the kind of genre that it is, of sort of being more mystery based, sort of thriller almost, and not necessarily a battle manga about like ninjas or something like that. Yes, we have the sort of demon aspect here, but fundamentally it was always more of a just this interesting world that has humans and demons in it, and the situation that the characters are in, what caused it, how do they get past it, and so on. That just always worked, and I think from start to finish, tonally it kept itself in check the whole way through. And I'm not one of these fans who feels that the series was only good for like the first 2-3 arcs basically, and after Goldie Pond it went downhill. I don't agree with that. I think there's still fantastic moments and arcs and stuff like that that do happen after Goldie Pond. I agree there are problems that do come in, but I'll get into specifically where I think those problems are and where there aren't problems as I go through it. But just know that, yes, the ending isn't great, but it doesn't ruin the series for me at all, pretty much. I wish the ending could have been better, because it's always great to be able to say with a series that it was like great at the start, great in the middle, and also, surprisingly, it had a very good ending as well. That's not the case here, but I agree on the first two bits of started well, middle was good, and I think most of how they got towards the ending, and a lot of the bits in the ending are actually very good, are what they needed to do for the Promised Neverland finale. They just didn't give it enough time. Like, literally, time is what you needed in the final arc. From revealing that Emma's lost her memories, you needed to have a few chapters gap between her losing her memories and us finding that out, and then the others finding her. That shouldn't have been 2 chapters. One she finds out, one she meets everyone else again. There should have been, at least in my mind, about 5 chapters in between. Build up the arc of like, whoa, we've gone like 4 chapters in a row, and like Emma's just on her own. She feels like she's missing something, but she doesn't know what it is. The others just can't find her. Everything's going well for them, but they just can't find her. And then finally you get that. That's where in the final chapter that whole idea of like that touch of destiny, of just seemingly out of nowhere, just the necklace going missing, you know, the spirits of characters long gone pulling Ray in one direction is what brings them back together. That would have much more impact if there was a gap, but there wasn't. And fundamentally, when I look at the list of arcs that I have written down here in the show, I go like, you know, good. And then the only one I really hesitate on saying just good on is the Human World arc, the last arc, the ending. That's the only one I go, except that one. So that's sort of how I view the series. But we'll get into a lot more discussion as we go through this. So let's start off with the list of arcs. So in my mind, this series has 9 arcs. Now, I've seen some places list this, I think the wiki listed as having 11 arcs, but I've sort of compiled 2 of them together. Like, it considers like the introduction arc to be like the first couple of chapters, and then the escape arc to be like the next chapters after that. I just said the escape arc is like the start to the escape. So, and then I considered the sort of forest arc and the shelter arc basically with Yugo to be basically the same thing rather than 2 separate arcs. So that's basically the situation here. So in my mind, the Promised Neverland is made up of the escape arc at the start, then we have the forest/shelter arc. This is followed by the Goldie Pond arc. That's followed by the Coveted Dollar arc. That's followed by the Norman returns slash like planning of the final battle arc. Then comes the Seven Walls arc. Then comes the Imperial capital battle arc. Then is Return to Gracefield House arc. And we end with the Human World arc, which is the ending. If you want to call, the last 2-3 chapters an arc, that's the way I view it. So I'm just going to go through this and kind of quickly give you some thoughts on each of these arcs. So the Escape arc, I think it's fair to say, the opening arc of The Promised Neverland is why I think this series got so much popularity. It's such a strong opening arc, to the point where I would say, is it? I think it is the best shonen opening arc out there. Because even the bigger series, like One Piece, like Naruto, Bleach, the ones that are super well known, their first arcs aren't their best. They improve as they go on. Their first arcs are usually much, much smaller in scale than they get to. And a lot of the strengths of those series only come out as the world evolves. And while you learn stuff past the initial arc with The Promised Neverland, the point remains that pretty much by the end of the first chapter, you get what they're going for. You get the direction they're heading in with just one chapter. And I think that's the strength here of stuff gets introduced as the series goes on, but you can clearly tell it's the same series start to finish. And it's literally a case of most of the stuff set up in the first arc is the majority of everything that the series includes. I'll get into the problems with some of the world building stuff as we go on later on in the series, but the Escape arc has everything. The introduction to our main trio of characters plus a whole extra kind of batch of characters. Isabella as the sort of main villain in a way, because the demons in the opening arc are more of just when they get out, they are going to have to deal with a whole other world. And it's all about what's the situation? How did the world get like this? And that's what they have to learn on the outside. And there's so many fantastic moments here, as we go through this arc of just Ray being revealed to be the traitor. Ray being revealed to be Isabella's biological son. Sister Crone kind of catching on to things, but then kind of agreeing to help them, offering them advice, and she'll answer all their questions. And she thinks she's sort of outsmarted Isabella, but then she's dead the next chapter. There was some amazing twists early on of just characters getting taken out. Norman's sacrifice, him not taking the opportunity to escape, but instead using it to scout ahead and reveal final information to the others, and basically giving them the escape plan that ends up working. And Ray then being willing to sacrifice himself towards the end, but Emma reversing that and being no, Norman knew this would happen and his plan is going to work. And just, in relation to where we are later on, Emma's selfish sacrifice. In the first arc, we basically saw Norman and Ray's selfish sacrifice. Now, Ray kind of gets a second one in the next arc in the forest by kind of running off to kind of lure a kind of beast somewhere else. But, the core idea here is the other characters did it earlier on. Emma waits until towards the end with the promise to make her kind of selfish kind of sacrifice. And that's a kind of theme across a lot of the main characters, is to note that. And I think most importantly, it's just the stuff with Isabella of just probably one of the most important reveals in early The Promised Neverland was that the moms are also cattle children. They have number IDs too. Isabella was in the exact same position as Emma before. She was this close to almost trying to escape herself, but she made a different choice than Emma did. She chose to kind of accept that probably the escape won't work. So I'll accept the offer to survive, and just a reveal of where the moms come from, basically. They are the kids who they view as being good enough to be part of the organization, to survive, have a kid of their own, and continue to be part of this. It's the tragedy of the moms is introduced straight away. And they escape, and Isabella ultimately at the end lets them go. And there's that sense of whoa, what's going to happen to her? And we don't come back to Isabella for a good while. I think there's maybe one moment like that we do touch back on her again, but for the most part, like, Isabella is gone from the story up until like basically the final arc. And I think this is an example of good long-term storytelling of when they come back to Isabella, they did a great job at sort of writing her character again after all that time. This is not a case of like this sort of late story fatigue that a lot of people felt that the writing had. To me, the start and end connection on Isabella's arc works so well. Just with the idea of she did let them go. So she's more on their side, seemingly. But then when they reintroduce her, she's Grandma Isabella and is back to sort of her villainous self like we saw her in the first arc. And they went over like how this happened. Peter Rattray kind of playing on all the typical insecurities and kind of issues you'd expect. And you get why she would make that decision. But then it's revealed to be a lie. And she actually got this position and was acting as a kind of undercover agent to get the position she needed to truly help the kids. And her kind of redemption and death, I think, was a very well done end of the character for sure. From there we move on to the forest/shelter arc. The main thing to note here is just that the forest until we meet Sanju and Mujika I don't think is the best arc. It's a nice insight into just the world as it is on the outside, but I think the introduction of Sanju and Mujika is definitely a key part here of demons who don't want to immediately kill them. Interesting demon characters who aren't just, maniacally villainous for no reason. Of like Mujika, this character who has never ever eaten humans, and Sanju, who did it in the past but doesn't do it anymore, and the idea that they can maintain their forms without eating demons, whereas like apparently it shouldn't work that way. And we get informed about the whole idea of what the promise is, and we get a big backstory on the world and the way it is, that you are in the demon side of the world. There is a human side, but you can't go there. And just setting up the idea of like, they thought on the outside they just had to escape this facility and they'd be in the human world, but they're in a whole demon world and they have to escape to the whole other side of the world to get out. That's a fantastic reveal. And just the idea that they become friends with Sanju and Mujika. The moment of Emma just talking on and on about her family to Mujika. And Mujika just... It's one of her first times meeting humans as well, and just realizing that, yeah, these are just people. And just showing there is your aim within the series, to get to a positive nature between humans and demons, because... given that they don't have to eat humans to survive, that means there's hope for the two groups. The promise came about because of one thing, but we can change that. So immediately a lot of the seeds planted early on. And then, of course, the William and Irva stuff was set up towards the end of the escape arc, but it comes into play very heavily here on the outside as their guide to safety is to find the shelter, where we're introduced to Yugo. Yugo, of course, is a fantastic character, and it's cool here because you see the idea of what if someone escaped but lost everyone along the way. And you see that basically that's what most of the characters in the Promised Neverland are in terms of like the human characters. They're basically, what if these characters had the same basic sort of setup or backstory in a way as Emma and the others, but things didn't go as well as they went for Emma? What if they didn't have that same ideological sort of drive, just that raw optimism to keep going? What if just the negatives of the world, got to them and they stopped? They couldn't maintain that optimism. That's what you get with basically Isabella. Peter Rattray, to a degree, is sort of that way as well. Can't move past his destiny. And Yugo is like that as well for the others, of just like sort of a successful escape, but what does the escape mean if you lost everyone close to you along the way? And just the kids being able to sort of return that optimism and hope into his life. And we see how much that character grows as the series progresses, to the point where he's willing to sacrifice himself for them in the later arcs. Very strong. But of course, this all builds towards the end, where Emma is of course separated from everyone. She's taken to Goldie Pond, which is the next arc, Goldie Pond arc. I think most people kind of regard this as pretty much being one of the best arcs in terms of like humans and demons as a focus in it. Luvis as the main villain. Just the idea of this hunting ground for the aristocrats, that they're not happy with the way things are either. Them just, getting their food from the factories and it being like that. They enjoy the thrill of the hunt. They don't want just helpless humans running and them to easily capture them. They want the humans to fight back. And so more or less giving them the means to fight back. They want that thrill of they could die in this, that humans in the past were a threat to them. They want to feel that rush again. And that's a very interesting dynamic, because we saw with Sanju on his introduction that he was also like that as well. He wants the humans to get back to a point where they're more equal with demons, so that hunting them is something that can justifiably happen and isn't just them preying on the weak. Of course, this is Emma getting introduced to the kids from the other farm who have escaped, basically. And, it's the likes of Oliver, Gillian, Nigel, and so on, Zach. But also Lucas, who was set up from the previous arc as someone close to Yugo. So there's that setup of, when those two meet, that's going to be such a fantastic moment. And obviously, they're sort of doubtful about things. They're just trying to survive. But Emma comes in, gives them hope, and they realize that we could actually do this. If we think this through enough, we can do this. And so the big battles kind of come into play, and we get the different groups of kids all laying ambushes for the other demons and so on. And we see kind of Noose and Numa kind of taken out. Bayon gets taken out, and it's all left with Luvis in the end, which, it's a great fight. We get to see Luvis as basically the best of the demons, with how fast he is, how incredible his abilities are, and they're so much beyond any human, basically. And the amount of traps that the kids have to put into place, and secondary traps on top of them, to in any way get the advantage on him is crazy. It's like 1 on 20, but he still nearly wins, basically. And if not for like Yugo arriving and so on, taking out his mask, but they do manage to take him out in the end. But there's that tease later on that like his body's gone. What's happened to him? Like what's gone? We thought if you get hit in the eye, you're gone as a demon. What's the situation here? But in the aftermath of Goldie Pond, we now have this very large cast. All the kids who escaped from Gracefield House, now with Yugo, Lucas, and all the other kids who escaped as well. And the cast is all of a sudden doubled. And I get it. This is ultimately a problem with this as a series. Because ultimately, I think it's fair to say, The Promised Neverland is a relatively small in scale story. It doesn't do particularly well with its large cast, in that a lot of the characters, despite being in the story since the beginning, we don't know all that much about. Like characters like Anna, for instance. She's there in certain scenes. She gets a moment here or there to shine because she has, certain specialities. But for the most part, like, she's never in the spotlight as a character. The same more or less applies to most of the Goldie Pond kids in the aftermath of the Goldie Pond arc. Gillian, they kind of just place in the position as like the opposition to Emma, she's more sort of cynical. She's not as optimistic as Emma. Oliver is always one of the older characters, one of the more leader characters. Nigel is your kind of tech guy, and so on. So it's always been this case of, in many ways, like the series has never really had more than just Emma, Norman, Ray, Isabella, and like Hugo Lucas, basically. Everyone else has always just been basically in a different category to them. And it's just been, we need this character to be a focus for a little bit, but then they'll fade into the background again. But even the same can't be said for the likes of Ray, who I would agree. Ray, I don't think is used particularly well. I would say after probably the initial section of like the forest arc going into the shelter, more or less, I think he's just placed in this position of like, he doesn't have a lot of the edge that he had in the first arc, where he was always the one who would counteract like Emma's optimism with pure sort of like pragmatism of like, okay, Emma, that's what you want to do, but here's why we can't do this, that for this, that, and that reason. The problem is that they sort of characterized Ray in the end of the escape arc, when he didn't have to sacrifice himself, going into the next arc, as sort of him beginning to agree and view things more from Emma's perspective. So while they have to keep him as the one who is more logical, they also have to be like, he's logical, but he agrees in general with Emma's points. So he can never sort of be the character that he was at the start, particularly. But we'll get to where they maybe could have used him a little bit more. So, in the aftermath of the Goldie Pond arc, this is where we go into the Kuvitadala arc, and it's more or less where they do the time skip within the series. They'd set it up from the start that they're leaving all of the kids who are 4 and younger behind. They don't escape. Meaning that, based on what they figured out with the farms, they don't harvest any of the kids until they're 6. So they have 2 years to try and figure basically out the world. How does it work? How can we get back to the human world? We have 2 years to accomplish what we need to do, and we have to make sure to get back to Gracefield House and break everyone else out before those 2 years pass. And they cover most of that time at this point. In or around the chapter 100 mark is when this happens. We basically get this pretty fast sequence of chapters where we lightning quick go through the idea of the groups go out to the different places based on the pen and the information that they got there, because again they got extra data from like Goldie Pond and so on, and they have to find the locations of Kuvitidala because they want to make a new promise, and to do that they have to talk to the One. He's the one who made the promise in the first place. To make a new one they have to go and see him. So they figure out that Kuvitidala, which relates to Emma's necklace with the eye of the dragon type thing, they have to figure that out. So they basically time skip over the course of like a month or so here to them actually finding Kuvitidala. This is where, like, pacing wise, you can say it does go very quickly. But my counterpoint to that has always been, what would it be if we showed more of that? Literally them just traveling? Like, we know the kids can survive through the forest. We don't have to have the forest arc again immediately after escaping. That doesn't need to happen every time they move from place to place. The kids at this point know how to defend themselves because they got training from Sanju and Mujika, and then they got training, I suppose, battle experience at Goldie Pond and so on from Yugo, from Lucas. They know what they're doing at this point. So I think they skip over 52 days, I think, to get there. I don't really have a problem with it doing that. Because it would have just been literally chapters for the sake of showing traveling, just to show traveling. Because they have the information of where it is, they just have to get there. So I actually respect the series having sort of brisk pacing at this point, and just they're there. That I get why that has to happen. To me, the problem with the Kuvitidala arc is that I think this lore side of things with Kuvitidala, the Seven Walls, the One, basically the magical aspects of the Promised Neverland are extremely underdeveloped. They're the most vague part of the series by a long shot. And I think the writer sort of takes the approach of just, I'll give you enough information for you to understand why the promise is a thing that is important. The promise is basically a wish from a genie, effectively. You can ask it, and when it's initiated, click of the fingers, it's done. It happens. In this universe, there is a thing out there that has basically magical powers that can just change space-time reality to being a new way, all of a sudden. That's all you basically need to know. That's the writer's approach. But in reality, they have to have the kids figure this out. And while they tell it to you as the reader, it feels like a bunch of mumbo-jumbo as they just skip through it, and it's like, oh yeah, we found out this information, you go 10 up, 10 down, 10 across, 10 at bottom, light and dark, night and day at the same time, go up and around to the same point, but it's like through space and time, and it's just a bunch of sort of mumbo jumbo dimensions, magic. There's nothing really to understand about it, I think, is the problem. The other thing would be that the one, or him, the demon god, whatever way you want to call him, he remains this enigma within the series. And I think it's purposeful, but it also feels very weird. Because over the course of the series, we learn that basically the demon's origin, if you could say there is one, is basically just that they sort of evolved from bacteria. And through sort of consuming stuff around it, they take on that form. The demons are literally meant to be the perfect representation of you are what you eat. So when they finally eat humans, that's when demons gain intelligence. That's all they tell us basically about the origin of demons. That doesn't explain how there is a demon god, because that origin implies that humanity has been around for longer than the demons. For the demons to have to eat humanity to gain their own intelligence, that would suggest that like the one as a demon god either came before all of that and created demons, or only came into existence after humanity. Yet he is this godlike being who is the actual god of the demons. Yet he's also the person that humans have to go to make a promise happen as well. And he doesn't seemingly seem to play favorites between humans and demons. He just is fair enough on whatever they want the promise to be. That's, I think, the problem with this, is that basically characterizing him to be a demon feels very weird in this series. And that it felt like they arguably should have just kept him, like, because like there's a whole dragon thing at this point. Like the one has that dragon. The dragon of Kuvitadala is just utterly unexplained. Again, the Kuvitadala part when they get there is kind of weird, because it's like it allows you to sort of see anything. So it allows Emma to see the one, see the dragon, but he basically says, no, come in through the proper entrance. You can only see me here. You're not actually like here with me. Come in properly and we'll play. So he basically says, I will talk to you if you come in through the 7 walls. That's basically all the Kuvitadala arc is. Again, it gets into the idea of what's the significance of the necklace with the eye kind of symbol, because that comes into play heavily in the ending, and it's kind of unclear about what that is. Obviously, it relates to magic in some way, and the whole idea of, oh wait, in the final chapter, Emma just randomly loses her necklace. Like, there's no panels that show it falling off or her bumping into someone and falling off. It literally is just gone from her neck. And the impression that you get is almost that because of what it is, that the one almost put it on the ground outside to allow this to happen. Is that the way you're meant to view it? As just, he is that playful god, basically, that ultimately he just wants to see some fun stuff happen in the world. So if this is the promise that you want, fair enough. But I'll cause strife with the first promise by basically asking for the best food possible, which effectively creates the queen's character flaw. Of the one is always given the best meat, meaning the queen can never have the best meat, but that's what she wants. And it creates this kind of insatiable hunger for the queen that is her character arc. For Emma, he's like, okay, I'll give you what you want, but I'll take away the thing that's most important to you, which is not just you won't be with your family, but you won't remember them at all. So it's this thing of like, that'll be fun to see how they kind of fix that. But again, the lack of any explanation really about that, I think, becomes a very frustrating part of the story at this point. Because, again, they come back, and this is where the time skip happens. They come back from Kuvitadala, and then they basically are like, over the last year and a bit, the exploring group has gone out and back multiple times. They've been to all these like 8 locations, and they're like very quickly in the space of like 2-3 chapters are like, we found the gold water over here, the temple over here, the other thing over here. That's it. And then before we can get the full explanation of like, here is how we go to the Seven Walls and make the promise. Andrew attacks the shelter. And that's basically the attack from Andrew is the end of the arc, with the idea of Hugo and Lucas sacrificing themselves for the other kids to take out Andrew and the others, with Andrew somehow surviving and being killed by Demon on the outside. But in the aftermath of this sets up the next arc with the return of Norman. But it is this weird arc where it is probably the one place where I'd say there maybe is some pacing problems of just, they just are like, boom, 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 we've solved the mystery. This really interesting mystery within the series of like, okay, what's going on? Kuvitadala, the whole idea of the gold water and the one and stuff like that. Very interesting. But then it's just like, yeah, we did it. We'll tell you later. And then when they do tell you later, it's just, it's so simplified. It doesn't feel like there was anything to figure out. Because it's literally just like, we just looked at the pictures and it told us what to do. We get the gold water and we put some of our blood in the gold water, and the moon is out and we put the Vita plant in it and we disappear into the other dimension. Makes sense, I guess. And that's the thing, like, you're not meant to know what's going on here, but that doesn't feel great because it's this important aspect of the series of like how the promise happens. And then there's the idea of this like, wait, how did like Julius Rattray in the past like do this and accomplish this? It just feels like such a convoluted thing that apparently is part of like ancient demon society, that they have murals for it in their history. It's really weird, just that ultimately, like, is it a case of just the world building is bad, or that they don't explain enough about like demon history, demon society? I'm not particularly sure. But the Kuvitadala arc is definitely one of the ones where I'd be like, that's maybe a part where they went a bit awry. And usually the 100 chapter mark is where it delivers quite strongly. Now, of course, they delivered the time skip here, which is valuable, but you know, that's what they had here. Next up, we have the Norman returning or planning arc. Now, I have the dual name on this because, yes, it is the idea of like Emma and Ray get to meet Norman again, but it's also the arc where he reveals his plan, which is the battle that happens in the capital, and his desire to basically eradicate demons from the world, and that's how they'll win, by taking over the demon world rather than finding a way into the human world, as Emma wants. I think this arc was really well done, of just the slow setup of like, we as the audience basically knew Norman survived earlier before this, but the kids of course didn't. And so they're brought to meet the boss, who they're like, wait, is this William Minerva? Because they were getting a few extra William Minerva things even after they thought he was dead. And they're shocked to see that it's him. He, in escaping, had, you know, taken the name William Minerva and had been helping them along as best he could, while also liberating all of the other plants. Now, again, it's in or around this mark here where they skip past a lot of interesting stuff. I don't feel they go enough into the actual like Lambda escape. I believe there's like a panel or two across like the entire series that maybe shows scenes in or around that time period of like Norman and how he specifically escaped and so on. I think that's sort of something you should have shown as like a proper flashback story of like the details of how Norman came together with his group, how they specifically escaped and did everything so well, and then him, how he decided to take up the William Minerva name, how he figured that all out. It's kind of there to a sort of degree, but not what you'd want. So there's another kind of, I think, slight missed opportunity of like Kuvitadala and the Norman Return arc both have sections that should have been expanded on. More heavy world building to the point where the audience can actually understand what's going on from Kuvitadala, and then proper backstory for Norman's escape from Lambda. Beyond that, I actually think the Norman Returns arc is really, really good because you get one of the more interesting, I think, aspects of the series, which is pitting the returned Norman against Emma in terms of their different ideologies on things. Emma, over the course of the journey we've seen her go on, has taken the view that demons shouldn't all be viewed the same way. our issue is with the people who run the farms and the government of the demons, not the demon populace. Whereas Norman, because he was sort of more tortured in an experimental lambda facility, has an extra hatred for demons because of what was done to him. The others, he has actually seen the mass production farms, whereas the others have only heard about them. It's that different perspective of, because Emma was sort of kind of shielded from some of the harsher stuff going on, her opinion is better on the demons than Norman's. Whereas if Norman had probably met Sanju and Mujika prior to the Lambda stuff, he probably wouldn't have the same opinion. And it's just that great perspective of their journeys have taken different paths, and now that they've reunited, it's great. They're happy to see each other again. It's a big emotional reunion, but they're at odds. Emma disagrees. Norman lays out his plan and what he wants to do, and nearly everyone else is agreeing. And it's left for Ray to go to Emma like, you don't agree with it, do you? And it's left to be like Emma kind of starting to cry of like, I know a lot of people aren't going to agree with me on this, but I don't want to kill all the demons. And this is another one of the things they refer to in the kind of final chapter, which is the idea of Emma making these almost selfish decisions because of her views on things, because of the optimistic outlook that she has, and her own basically ideology viewpoint in the series, which is to always see the best in things, which works out well in many cases, but can also be viewed as being like not very pragmatic. So this is where you see Ray being like, oh, I get your point of view, but I also see where Norman's coming from, and him having to be like, you should explain this to him so as not to cause a rift. So this is when, of course, you know, he's making the deal with Galen, and we see just the extent of, I suppose, how brutal his plan is and what he plans to do to like wipe out all of the demons. That like Vincent is developing the gas that sort of degenerates the demons. He's organized. He's like researched the demons to the point where he knows this clan that was slighted in the past and is going to use their want for vengeance against them, and is basically just going to let them loose in the capital to kill everyone. It's a clever plan, but it's very much like destructive. That's all he cares about, is like humans have to win, and he sees no hope for peace. And even when Emma explains her plan, he still isn't really on board. He roughly kind of gets around to the idea of like, I guess, okay, you go in, try and figure stuff out with the Promise and the Seven Walls, but we're still basically going ahead with this. But he does sort of say to her that like, we won't go as far as you think. But then immediately has like Don and Gilda go after Sanju and Majika, and there's the whole idea of what orders exactly has he given here? Has he ordered basically, you know, Sanju and Majika killed or not? Because that's the big issue here. Those two in particular, Emma doesn't want killed, but she also doesn't want the entire demon population just wiped out, full stop. So that's the kind of setup as we kind of head into the Seven Walls arc, which, again, like the Kubitadala arc, I think ends up being a lot of mumbo-jumbo, considering it was probably one of the most hyped parts of the series in a way, of like, we're finally actually going to go into the dimension of the One. And it ended up just being a bunch of just like, ooh, is this symbolic? You know, look, Emma's younger, Ray's older, the dimension is weird. We sort of can control it with our minds and viewing things in the right way and controlling the world. And then, like, the seven walls represent, like, the dimensions type of things, like up, down, left, right, plus, like, time and space either way and so on. And it's like, okay, I guess, like, again, at this point we see the explanation for how you actually go into the seven walls, which was the gold water, you put some blood in it, and the Vita plant again goes into it. And that combination basically poofs you out of the world into this dimension. And it's literally magic, like they literally just disappear. So an immediate question I would have is like, what on earth is the gold water? Now, clearly it is some sort of a teleportation type thing, because they always show the gateways from the demon world into the human world as being sort of elevators, but elevators on sort of rocky platforms that don't really connect to anything in a pool of gold water. So clearly, to some degree, those elevators, the way they are meant to operate, I would guess, is that they activate the gold water to basically teleport that somewhere else into the other world. So that's the best way I can explain it, is that basically you're meant to view the gold water as basically sort of being sort of a teleportation water. It sounds crazy, but I think that's the way you're actually meant to view it. But again, I would have loved a proper explanation on that. But like I said, it's just a few chapters of just, look how weird things are. And it's fun to see those visuals of like an older Rey, but you never really believe that like it failed, that Rey is now super old and Emma's now young and this is the way it's actually going to be. So when they finally get around to the idea of they get the cube inside it, and then like the black hole inside that, and they decide to go into it, it's like, okay, yeah, that's it. That's the whole point. This is the final gate to reach the one. And then Emma's there, but Rey isn't. And it's like, Rey can't come because he overthought it. It's like, fine. And then on the other side of the story, of course, what's happening is that you have Don and Gilda going after Sanju and Mujika, and they find them. But then you find out that Hayato and Jin have brought a lot of the Lambdas, the kind of Adam clones, after them. And their orders are basically to kill them. So Norman has effectively betrayed Emma's trust here, and that's the setup. And then we move into the Imperial Capital battle arc, which I suppose for some people, this is probably the point at which the series goes into full kind of really fast pace mode and like everything's happening. But I still think it's all basically here. Like, I think they do what they need to in this arc of, I really liked the backstory with Gillen as like the previous clan member who was replaced by the Doza clan by betrayal, and them wanting revenge for that. That the clans have made mistakes, and here are those mistakes of the past coming back to haunt them. And so immediately most of the clans get wiped out by the Gillen clan. And Ligra Valima is nearly killed by the Gillen clan as well, because they're revealed to be, very powerful. They introduce a lot of the kind of mechanics of how demons work, of like when they consume their own, they gain more power and so on. And it all builds to the idea of Gillen ultimately was just meant to be sacrificed to the queen to weaken her, because of course the crazy abilities that demons have still use up energy. They're not godlike beings, as crazy as their abilities are. And that weakens the queen enough to the point where Norman's lieutenants, basically Zazie, Zizlo, and so on, are able to, basically take out the queen. And it seems like she's taken out. Zazie stabs her eye and so on. And this is when we get the idea that she actually can regenerate. She has a second core, and it goes all crazy. But before that, it is in between regenerations is when the Emma and Norman big conversation happens. Now, this is a point where I think I disagree with a lot of people on. A lot of people didn't like that because they just blanket criticism just said talk no jutsu, therefore bad. And I don't really ever agree with that much, because, look, this series was never really a battle manga. Like, it every time it did a battle, it either had to be between two demons or between humans with everything going in their favor, and the demon weakened in some way. It wasn't ever really a battle manga, so of course it was always going to come down to some sort of a talking situation, that Emma was going to convince Norman to come back. That was always going to be the way it goes. This series wasn't going to take that dark turn. And I think a lot of the criticism that I've seen comes down to that. It was people wanting the series to do something like that, to kill off one of the main characters out of the blue, and there be huge consequences for this, or have something crazy happen, like this character remains a villain or does something really terrible. But in the end of the main characters, this was always going to be the way that it was. Emma convincing Norman that, like, you don't need to do this. You don't need to kill yourself just for us. You know, do the right thing here. Join us. Stop doing this. Stop killing people. You don't need to do it. And it eventually hitting home with him of he's missed them and he doesn't need to be like this. That he became this person because of everything that happened. And Emma's optimism is finally sort of coming back. The person that he's always been begins to return a little bit. And there's always those teases of like, oh, are his lieutenants going to really like not agree with this and they're going to like betray him or something like that. But no, they ultimately support Norman, and so when he joins up, they all join up as well. And this is when the Queen's secondary form comes into play, and we also get the arrival of Sanju and Mujika on the scene. And I actually really liked the way they did the second one. It was all action-packed for the Queen's first core, but for the second core, it was more of just, here is an example of a demon just becoming so monstrous, just being defined by their consumption, that she is consuming kind of everything around her and isn't even eating it properly. So she's not even digesting her food properly. She's just taking it all in for the sake of taking it all in. And she just becomes this kind of mess because that's what she ate. And in the end, I like the explanation of like what happens here, of just the kind of Queen's backstory of like, she never got the perfect meat. And because of that, she's always felt like she's never had anything. And I think it's that line, like, you know, you're so, from what is it, from Mujika, it's like, you know, you eat so much, but you're always starving or something like that. And it's because, you know, what sort of a general viewpoint is it to just be greedy and consume everything? There's no substance to you if all you are out there to do is just consume. And in the end, it comes back to bite her, of like, she loses so much energy, and because she hasn't digested her food properly, because of the way demons work and the idea of like the powers of, in a way, the things that she eats becomes part of her, she doesn't even have the energy to take that all in, and so she gets sort of reverse consumed by what she's eaten. And I think that's a very fitting end for the Queen. I never felt like the Queen was meant to have a particularly strong ideology of like, you're meant to be like, conflicted by what's going on with her. No, like, you are meant to disagree with the demon government because of what they did. That was one of the better set up parts of the story, that Mujika's blood was the solution this entire time. But to keep power, to keep control of the populace, the demon leadership decided to make Mujika out to be this heretic and say that her blood is cursed, even though it could have led to an era of prosperity for the demons. But instead, they kept it for themselves to keep control and maintain power. And that is something obviously that needed to be taken down, which is why, you know, Norman what he ends up accomplishing here is he kills most of the leadership, people in the leadership positions, but Mujika and Sanju end up saving most of the population. So, you know, I think that all works, you know, really well. And it's like at this point we get like Luvis arriving in and so on. He saves Sanju and Mujika from being executed. And I think that works. Like, I do think Luvis needed a little bit more. Luvis needed more setup. That's one thing I'll agree with. They needed to explain his sort of ideology a little bit more. Now, I think they maybe took it as the idea of like, oh no, but we already told you what his ideology was, because he said, you know, like, humans are the best, basically, towards the end of like his when he died, basically, the first time, he basically said humans are the best. So he has a certain respect for them, and he wishes things were the way they were from the past. That was always there. He never particularly liked the farm system, and ultimately accepts that the humans have won this day. Look at what they've accomplished. We must change and be better going forward. And again, you know, it's one of those things where he's basically, in making these decisions, he can't do hunting anymore, which with Sanju they explain away fairly well, of like, yeah, I was kind of stupid this whole time to continue to want humans even though I didn't need them anymore. I don't know if I quite saw that development with Luvis, but ultimately the idea of him convincing the populace that of the truth of, you know, the conspiracy, basically, of the leadership of like, Mujika is your savior, not the heretic you view her as. And just the visuals of him, like, you know, cutting Sanju open and then like drinking his blood, of like, oh well, if Luvis is willing to drink his blood, we can do it too. It will save everyone. I kind of agree on the point that people have made about the idea of like the general populace of demon society being a little bit like, oh, we've made this big change, yay, we've made this big change in reverse, yay, we reversed it again, yay. They just kind of go along with things. But at the same time, ultimately, you had basically a lie that's existed for so long. That is the way they viewed things. Then there was clear, with Mujika's blood, like reversing basically the poison. There was proof that it actually helped. And then it took, you know, the final lie from Peter Rattray basically to convince them back on the other side, and then Luvis convinces them back again. I think they do just enough of like, the people have been lied to for a very long time, that there's the truths that are kind of coming out. You get why they're so kind of monumental, and why the demon people would be so sort of swingy back and forth, in that most of the populace is probably fine with the idea of not eating food anymore. And they present, I think, fairly well the idea that, yes, there's always going to be demons who like the taste of meat and want to eat it and so on. But for most of the normal demon people, they would prefer the idea of just being able to exist without the fear of degeneration than not have any food at all. There's a difference with the idea of like, you know, you can't eat a food anymore, but if you can't, like, you lose something, versus, yeah, you won't be able to eat this anymore, but you also won't need it anymore. It's like, it's not quite the same thing. But so it's quick, it's sudden, but I do think it works, combined with the idea that they had resurrected the sages at this point, and so they were there to sort of back up some of those claims also. And I think that in general worked, and the idea of like finishing off Mujika's character arc with the idea that she, the heretic her entire life, just wanting to help people, everything she's done in her life has been to help fellow demons, basically, to avoid what's happened to them. Hunted down, nearly killed her whole life, if not for her protectors. She finally is given the position of leadership, that the demons have accepted finally someone as their leader who is purely out to help them. That works perfectly for me. This transitions us into the Return to Gracefield House arc, which, again, this is this arc that was set up since very towards the beginning of the series, that we were always going to return to Gracefield House because we had to get Phil and the others back. That we have to get them back first before the promise is activated. That was the kind of key thing in all of this. So this is where we get our big battle against Peter Rattray, and I suppose the Rattray clan as well. Now, ultimately, this arc, yes, it goes very quickly, very smoothly. There's a couple of twists and turns with regards to like, oh, Peter Rattray's taken everything over, but this is, of course, where they have the Isabella arc play an important role of like, she ends up sort of being the kind of factor in all of this, but then she's actually against him. So that completely leads to his defeat here, in combination with just the fact that the kids are revealed to be clever. He views them just as the children who are only there to be eaten. Little does he know that, like, effectively, he is the one who has effectively facilitated them being smart enough to outsmart him in all of these situations. And again, they return to the idealistic point of view here of Emma offering her hand out to even Peter Rattray. You could come with us to the human world and change things with the new promise. But the backstory, I think, worked here of Peter Rattray can't do that because he felt so betrayed in the past when James Rattray, William Minerva, in his mind betrayed the clan. And so Peter can't bring himself at all to do that. he is so locked into that destiny of the Ratri clan, that is the promise, that he just cannot bring himself to accept going along with things. And it's the idea of he couldn't break free of his destiny. Isabella, on the other hand, ultimately sort of is able to, but sort of her moment of doing that is her sacrificing herself, basically for the kids, being killed by a demon and not quite being able to go with everyone, but redeeming herself in a way in front of everyone for like the second time, basically, within the arc. I actually quite like that. I think this final sacrifice, just to show that like someone important did die, this didn't work out perfect for everyone. I think that actually did work quite well. I know some people were sort of upset that like, oh, Isabella like maybe should have survived, but that's sort of the back and forth of the fandom. Some people are criticizing things because they don't kill off characters, but then they do kill off a character and you're like, no, not that one. That's not the character you wanted to die. That's not the consequences you wanted to happen. Different consequences. And it's like, no, this made sense. The other moms are going to have their futures, but Isabella unfortunately isn't. But she did enough to redeem herself in the end and find out just before her death that none of the kids really hated her. They've always viewed her as their mother, and that's a very powerful note to sort of end on. So a lot of that stuff, I think, right towards the end of this arc, I think was pretty well done. I suppose going back a little bit, I didn't talk about a few other little things like the backstory on the first Promise. I actually really liked that. It was, again, maybe not as extended as I thought it would be, but it actually fit in perfectly to explain things, of just having these older characters in the past who are clearly where, like, the ancient ancestors of a lot of our main cast, of like the main guy is clearly like one of Emma's ancestors and so on, and you can see so clearly that like, these were the origin of the sort of genetics in a way of most of the cattle children. This explains why we have all these different types of people in one kind of house, basically, is because it's because of where they came from. Julius Ratri, in his effort to sort of end this war, end this conflict, sacrifices his allies to make the promise and help what's left of humanity, but in the process sort of sacrificing his clan to always have to guard over this promise, and creating that kind of destiny for the clan. That, to me, worked really well to kind of bring everything together. Again, I think just we need a little bit more setup on the demon side of things with regard to their origins and the one, who he is specifically. Why is he like the demon god, but he's actually doing something that sort of helps demon. He kind of helps humans and not just demons. It's like, just do a little bit more. But then we get the ending arc, which, like I said in my reviews over the course of the week, it's only like 3 chapters, and it hits a lot of the beats that you want it to. Again, the series from where it started was, you know, I'll actually just read it out here since I have volume 1 in front of me. Like the Promised Neverland, page 1, chapter 1 opens up with, you know, the lady I fondly call mom is not my mom. The children I live with are not my siblings. This is Gracefield House, an orphanage, and I'm an orphan, or so I thought. You know, and she just talks about how, you know, it's really happy. She lives here with her family. She's one of the oldest. You know, our personality, our ages, our skin colors all differ. We're not related by blood. But I love them all. I love mom. I love everyone. Even if we're not related by blood, they're my family. This orphanage was my home. Everything here. And she then starts to reveal some of the, like, wait, all white uniform, ID numbers on necks, tests. And so I felt they were always going to bookmark the series with something similar to that, of like, you know, Emma happy, living together with everyone in a house, but this time without those extra bits on the end. This time actually free, which is ultimately what they did. But it didn't hit home as hard because they gave no time whatsoever to allow the last final emotional arcs to linger. And it's because I have it noted here. It's the previous page, I think. Chapter 141, so 40 chapters before the end of the series, is when the reward for making the promise is sort of teased. Emma mentioned there is one, but that it's fine. She makes it with the one. He says he wants a reward, and we have to wait basically 39 chapters for it to be revealed. And this is probably, in a way, the biggest mistake that the series makes in terms of setting something up and teasing it for a very long amount of time, and it not really delivering. Because when it was revealed that, oh, your memories are taken away, it's like, that's it? Like, everyone, I think, thought it would be something more clever than that. And then when it was that, and you're like, okay, the memory thing will work if you give it time to play out and then have everyone come back together. But because there's only a chapter between the reveal of what the reward is and the ending of the series, you don't have the time to... You really don't have the time to take in, oh, these are the consequences of that. By the time you finally have, it's already been resolved. And while they don't reverse the whole idea of Emma's memories being gone, they don't just give them back to her. They end on basically the positive note you would expect it to end on. And so that to me is just the problem of this series has ultimately delivered, I think, a lot of very nice emotional moments between characters. But this one, they just did not give the time to develop. Like I've said many times before, how much more impactful would it have been if we had, say, an entire volume? Say the last volume of The Promised Neverland opens up with chapter 180, where we find out about the reward. Emma's memories are missing. And we get that chapter of her sort of just on her own with the old man. And we get the other kids in the human world. Where's Emma? We have to find Emma. And then we continue on for more or less an entire volume up until the final chapter. And that whole middle section of the last volume is a combination double story. Half of the story is Emma on her own, new life, new name, just trying to figure out. Having these dreams, these memories when she sleeps. Thinking that she's missing something but not being able to remember at all what it is that she's missing. Just knowing that something is missing from her life. And ultimately, over the course of these 8 chapters or so in the middle of this volume, you have Emma on her own come to accept that she's never going to figure out what those dreams are about. She has to get on with her new life. On the other side of that same story, across those 8 chapters, you have the other kids desperately trying to find Emma at the same time as they've found happiness in the human world. Everything's working out okay. The other kids can go to school. They can do whatever they want, pursue their passions. They all have their sort of positive kind of moments. They also put time into searching for Emma and trying to get her back. They search the entire world with the help of the good section of the Rattray clan, Mike Rattray, and they just don't find her. We see Ray in this country, Norman in this country, no sign of her whatsoever. And then, as the chapters are coming to an end, what about the forbidden zones that have been destroyed by war? Along the way, I suppose, on that side of the story, you could have explained more about what has happened in the human world specifically, what caused the war, what solved the war and led to kind of peace at this point. Those type of things. They could have delivered that here, to where there's actually an impact to why the kids are then allowed to go to those other areas to search for Emma. And you just needed maybe a little bit more setup of maybe the one is orchestrating stuff. Maybe a slight tease as we transition from the second last chapter into the last chapter of destiny is somehow going to find a way to bring them together. And you do basically the final chapter that we got, but of course now it has a whole lot more setup, but it's still effectively what happens here. The other thing I would say is that I don't like how the epilogue of basically the series is just delivered in 2-3 panels at the end of the series of just, here's most of the Gracefield House kids, here's the Lambda characters, and it's just a third of a page really small versions of the characters, and it's just like Barbara's an athlete or a boxer or something like that, and it's like Nigel has a laptop, and it's like that's the epilogue for those characters. It's like that's not good enough. And then the other thing I'd say just on the ending is the one thing I really didn't like was that I don't like that the last page is not like a full page shot. I don't like that the series doesn't end on any particular visual. Like, it's just Emma sort of like, what is it again? It's like Emma sort of like holding like Norman and Ray's hand or something like that, of like, I want to be friends with you now. And it's not even like a full page spread or anything like that. They're just randomly in the middle of town. They've literally just figured this out. There's no cut ahead to the future with them all living happily together, a little bit older. None of that. It's just, okay, Emma is going to be a bit more open with them and try and pursue a friendship with them. And it's like, let's live together. Cut to a random 3/4 shot panel of like birds that are kind of cut off on the panel. Okay is like the last word of the series. It's like, what sort of an ending is that in terms of being memorable at the end? In the sense of like, what's the last page of Bleach? The last page of Bleach is Ichigo's son revealing that he's a Shinigami, and everyone being like, whoa, it's going to happen again, like he's going to grow up to be really powerful. The last page of Naruto is like the same legend that started the series, like the way it's told of like, what is it, like there once was a nine-tailed fox or whatever, it was sealed in a baby, and then this time they tell the full story of like, that boy went on to become the 7th Hokage. Like, they have that same sort of slightly different art style telling this like legendary story, but on the last page it's like, 7th Hokage style stuff, with the idea that you also have the reveal of like Boruto and stuff like that there before. Those work. You didn't have any of that here in the ending of The Promised Neverland, which was, in my mind, really unfortunate that you only ended on the bare minimum of literally just, it's going to be okay because Emma is opening up to them. She doesn't know who they are, but she has a sense that these are the people she does need to be with. And that's it. Is that enough? I don't think so. So they're my main things with this series. Like, I didn't take too many notes, as you can see here. It's a pretty small amount of stuff. I literally just have like, 40 chapters between the reward tease and the reveal, demon origin, the origin of Mujika's blood, what's the deal with the dragon and the one, details on the Lambda escape, and then a few other things that I took notes for, more about the last chapter specifically. So yeah, I think the only thing I didn't really properly talk about here in the video was Mujika's blood and the origin of Mujika. I think this is one of those ones where like the backstory we got in Mujika only starts with the idea that Mujika exists. There's no explanation given whatsoever about, in a way, like how or why Mujika suddenly has this special ability, why her clan has this completely unique ability that completely solves the species-wide problem of them not being able to hold on to a form unless they constantly eat that thing. I think that actually was quite a mistake. Mujika is a great character, but it doesn't work to me to just be like, here's the solution in character form, without any reasoning behind why it happened. Like, was this just like a spontaneous mutation that happened of like literally Mujika is a demon born with a special ability, in the same way that, say, the royal family are born with the extra core? Mujika was born with this special ability to grant blood to other people. If that's what it's meant to be, then fair enough. If they're meant to present the idea that in demon society there are these sort of blood mutations that add special abilities into the blood pool, or whatever way you want to call it, into the genetic pool, that's fine. I just wish they'd said something about it. Similarly, the origin of demons, like I said earlier on, they just basically, Norman very briefly explains, the theory on the origin of demons is that they come from just bacteria, that bacteria gradually evolved and stuff like that, and then once it started to consume stuff, it becomes that, and they eventually consumed humans, and became intelligent. No sense for like was it literally just random they kind of came into existence, or was there a story behind it? Did the one make the demons or anything like that? Because it does feel like there's meant to be some sort of a thing of like, wasn't an experiment gone wrong by humanity? But no, because going all the way back in time, humanity wasn't like advanced enough to really do anything like that. So it very much does seem like it was just a sort of evolution type thing. Bacteria evolved, became demon bacteria cells, and became demons as we know them now. I'm fairly okay. I don't mind the demon origin thing too much. The Majika origin thing, similarly, I don't really mind too much that we didn't get an explanation. But it highlights that when it came to more technical details of world building in the series, they didn't really go into it that much. That's my main point there. So yeah, in general, I feel like I did an okay job at summing up everything here. It's a long video, but it's also 181 chapters to cover. Like I said, there's good stuff, I think, in every arc. Like, even though I criticize stuff like the Kubitadala arc, there's still the really emotional kind of last stand of Yugo and Lucas at the end of it. And the general idea of like, oh, like they have the information they need now, the plan to do the 7 walls. That all works, like highlighting that even at some of the weaker points in the series, there was still good stuff happening. And so I disagree with the idea that the series really heavily lost its way after Goldie Pond. There's fantastic stuff that happens after Goldie Pond. Norman's return, the whole issue there, him setting up the whole thing with Gillen, the backstory that we got about the original Promise in the first place. As we went on, I liked Norman and Emma's kind of discussion that led to Norman turning back on side. Isabella's arc towards the end. So much of that stuff actually did really, really work for me. So I still really love the series. That's the best place to sort of end on here. So yeah, they're my thoughts here. Again, I will be reviewing the Promised Neverland anime, so stick around on the channel for that when it comes back. But let me know your thoughts on the Promised Neverland overall. But that's been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.